Welcome to Opportunity in America, the official podcast of the Economic Opportunities Program at the Aspen Institute. Today, as a complement to our regular event series, we're pleased to present a special conversation between our Executive Director, Maureen Conway, and Michael Lastoria, founder and CEO of the pizza chain And Pizza. The core of our work here at the Aspen Institute rests on increasing the number of good jobs in our economy, and Michael has been a leader and an innovator in this space for many years. In this conversation, which took place in March of this year, we learn how the desire to create good jobs inspired Michael to launch And Pizza in the first place. We discuss how better jobs lead to better business outcomes. We uncover the strategic value of soliciting feedback from employees. We outline the problems with treating labor as a commodity. We discuss how new technologies can enhance workers' experiences on the job, rather than simply attempting to replace them. And we identify the role of government action in serving to raise the bar across industries. It's a fast-moving and far-reaching conversation, and we hope you enjoy.
Hi, Michael. Thanks so much for talking with us today about And Pizza. And to get started, I'd like you to take us back to the beginning. You founded a number of businesses, but you seem to be trying something a little bit different with And Pizza. So why pizza? And what was the vision you had when you started the company, particularly as it relates to how you were thinking about the kind of jobs you wanted to create?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to, my founding story as a human. I was born and raised in a very rural hamlet, 60 miles south of Buffalo, New York. You can imagine the climate was cold, but it was very rural and very poor. And when I finally made my way to New York City at 22 and had some success in both advertising technology and creative services, owned an advertising agency, I really wanted to create a brand that gave back. And the general idea behind And Pizza and the ampersand itself, because it is kind of a goofy name, was about promoting unity and uniting the working class around fair and living wages. And so it was this giant experiment around, can we build a business that both takes care of its workforce and is profitable and is attractive both from outside capital and from a growth perspective? And when I looked across a multitude of industries, the reason we chose food service and ultimately pizza was because the food service industry was quickly becoming the largest employer in the US, now employs roughly 10% of America's workforce, and felt like if we could enact change in such a important sector and industry, like broadly speaking, that we could have more impact. And so didn't really know much about the food service industry, didn't know much about restaurants, and just started researching. The reason we chose pizza in all of sort of the food service or restaurant categories, because it was fun, because it could be lighthearted, because it's loved by all. And I think there's no real ceiling to the scalability of a pizza concept. And so that's ultimately what gave birth to And Pizza. We started off renting out an art studio in West Chelsea in New York and packed our bags and moved to Washington, D.C., where we opened up the first pizza shop in July of 2012. And now we have 65 company-owned operated locations from New York down to Southern Virginia.
Wow, that's really impressive. And I do love pizza, so I like the choice. When you were doing this, was there anybody that you kind of looked to for inspiration when you were getting started? And are there folks you've learned from along the way as you've tried to build the business with the kind of values you mentioned about, creating good jobs?
Yeah, I think, in reading, the Good Jobs Manifesto, there's a lot of mentioned companies in there as case studies that definitely helped shape, how we thought about what success ultimately meant. And ironically, if you go back and look at, decades earlier, a lot of fast food brands that were started in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you could even maybe throw Starbucks in there in the 80s. I think the businesses that have thrived, over a multitude of decades and have gone through all different types of economies and presidents, both Republican and Democratic. I think the one thing that stands true is the companies that actually have the healthiest businesses today and have the healthiest bank balances and balance sheets are those that historically paid higher wages, really thought about the worker as someone critical to the success of the organization, not just a cog in the wheel, and never viewed commodity simply or labor simply as a commodity. And so you can look at the Chick-fil-A's of the world, whether you believe in their political affiliation or not, the In-N-Out burgers of the world, the Starbucks of the world, and obviously today they all have their own version of scars and wounds just going through decades and decades of growth. But these are organizations that have proven, not just to me, but to the industry, that you can pay high wages, you can treat the worker, you can provide benefits, both traditional and non-traditional, and you can build an entire organization around internal development, promotion, and doing the right thing and have multi-decade success. And so I think it's important to note that the biggest and the best, happen to have been really long-term minded in what we call playing long ball, but never making short-sighted decisions about what's right for the P&L for that particular month, period, or quarter. I've always thought about, if I could do things the right way and time was not against me, then I am going to build a workforce that's invested, that's appreciated, supported, and engaged. At the end of that rainbow, you're going to find a far healthier business with better margins, a better company culture, and ultimately a better product as a result of that, because you want those incentivized that are talking to your guests, that are making your food, to ultimately be and feel like they're a part of that company and they're part of that experience, because that's when they're going to give their best. And most importantly, you're supporting them as an individual. Who doesn't want that? Right? A dollar doesn't stretch that far in America these days. And if you can just give someone an extra $1, $2, or $3 and make them feel themselves like they're deserving, that they're deserving of that, then it really is a special thing. And it makes, running a business like this far more interesting day to day, because you're actually helping people.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I mean, you talked earlier about sort of the growth of And Pizza, and it's, remarkable. Congratulations on the success of the company. Can you talk a little bit about what has sort of been driving the growth, and sort of you mentioned some of the scars some of your inspiration companies have had. How do you think about that as you try to think about how you grow And Pizza in a way that you continue to keep it true to sort of the vision you have for it as a company?
Yeah, well, it's tough when it, passes hands from, father or mother to son or daughter or anything in between. That I think is always challenging when you're passing it down from generation to generation. Always creates complexity. But I think there's something to be said about the authenticity of the reason you got into the business in the first place, and never really compromising on that set of principles or values that led you to where you ultimately had that product market fit, had that success, and started to really scale up. And I think when often businesses go wrong, it's not just through the insertion of private equity capital or venture capital or the capital markets. It often has to do with making decisions that are based more on near-term profit than long-term sustainability. And so for us, when you have a business whose symbol is literally an ampersand, and that ampersand, as I mentioned, is all about unity, uniting the working class. It's a constant reminder day in and day out who we serve, who we work for, and why we're doing this to begin with. And so even when we've been faced with some of the most difficult, conditions that, COVID had brought, as it's wreaked havoc on, the restaurant industry in general, the one thing that we stood by was always making sure that our employees were continuously paid more year over year than the prior year, and making sure that we could do our best to guarantee jobs in a time of uncertainty. And so I really think it comes down to, reminding everyone constantly why you exist, and then getting enough people, even new investors or shareholders around the table, to believe that your success is directly correlated to how you treat your workforce, and that you cannot decipher between the two. You can't look at financial success and say, well, what if we cut wages, or what if we didn't increase wages this year? What would happen to the P&L of the company? We don't even have those conversations as a shareholder group, because everyone knows the importance of it to the success of the organization. So I think that continuity is critical. And perhaps if this business changes hands one day, you'd expect that, the buyer of this company, or if we go public, the shareholders would really appreciate and value that continuity. And there's enough proof points out there to point to other companies that have done it at scale that never compromise. And as I mentioned before, have some of the healthiest margins and healthiest balance sheets, decades later. Yeah,
that's great. And that, I think, leads to sort of my next question, which, you talked about, the ampersand being for the unity and making the workers feel valued. And you've also talked about your hopes to sort of, democratize decision-making in the workplace, and, and really kind of having workers feel like their voices are heard. So what do the voices and input of And Pizza workers mean to you and your company? And how are you thinking about ways to make sure that their voices are heard and acted upon, and they see that?
Yeah, then the input's critical. I think it's important to recognize that the further you as a leader get away from the day-to-day operations, meaning you can't be in the pizza shop or in the restaurant or any retail location, hour by hour, shift by shift, day by day, week by week. You want that continuity. Your continuity is through your workforce. Okay, they're the ones that ultimately are the eyes, and they're the ones that are the ears behind what's happening. And quite frankly, they're really a good testing ground for innovation and to make sure that you're not missing anything in terms of ways that you can improve both the guest experience as well as the product. And so for us, it started off with just text message. I know it sounds very basic, but we have a text message only platform, both for customers and employees. Obviously, every employee has my cell phone number, which may seem rare. We have 1,200 employees, but the reality is, when you give people an opportunity to connect with you directly, you'd be surprised at how well they treat you as a result of that. Meaning, if you treat people with the respect and the dignity and the trust that here's my cell phone number, call me whenever you want, most people actually respect that, and they don't call you, past midnight, even though I have fun text conversations from sometimes midnight to 2 a.m. on a Friday or Saturday when people aren't working in the shops. But they respect, your privacy, they respect your time. And it's just another way to say, if you need me, I'm here, use it as you see fit. And then we have a company text line that we call the pizza plug that any of our workers can text, sort of 24/7. And we, on the other end, have a GX tech line that services both our employees and our customers. We're available to communicate back and forth. And so we send out, as you can imagine, like a ton of random messages, especially through the thick of COVID and the pandemic, just checking in, saying hi, video, voice, text copy. And there's a lot of two-way communication. And I jump into that text line all the time as sort of a quote unquote like guest experience worker. And I communicate both with our customers and our employees to make sure that, I'm here doing the work and that I'm incredibly accessible. So that's like a basic way of just how do you improve the communication so that if someone has an idea or you want to get to all 1,200 of your workforce instantly, like we have a system that supports that. And we developed, robust data sets around the themes that we're hearing. And then it's making sure that we can get in front of and address the entire company at least once a quarter. I prefer once a month, and I prefer more than that on a shop by shop basis, but make sure that we're presenting, hey, here are the sort of 10 themes that we've heard from you all vis-a-vis text message over the last 90 days. And here's how we're addressing each one of them. And what's interesting is that when we initially started this, it was often one-way dialogue, and it quickly became two-way and got to a point where I would actually let our workers debate whether or not we rolled out policy X or policy Y, or we'd say, hey, our benefits budget for this year is $2.5 million. Like, if you could choose to spend that $2.5 million, how and where would you spend it? And let them debate what's the most important to them, prioritize it. What's funny is that 9 times out of 10, they are making the same exact decision that you would make. And that 1 time out of 10 that they don't, it's a better decision than you would make. The only difference is they feel incredibly invested in that entire process because you're including them in the decision making. It's not that hard, right? It doesn't take that much more time to do it. You're just soliciting feedback and making sure that people understand there are still constraints to running a business. Our budget's not unlimited, right? We can't do everything that you want all the time. Here's what we can do. Here's where it comes out of the budget. Here's how it impacts the financials. You tell us how you'd like us to spend it. So that's just a good example of a way that you can really close the loop and make sure that the voices of your workers are truly being heard across everything that you give to them, and then everything that influences company decisions about the number of locations that you think is appropriate for growth, right? Where you should ultimately be growing, what type of pizzas or product innovation or ingredients should you be serving. And the nice part about our business is that there's nothing like overtly technical or complicated, right? You could walk into a pizza shop tomorrow and probably give me 10 different ideas that you have in ways that we could improve or change it. And so it makes it very human where everyone can influence and interact. And then I think on top of that sits what we call, FAM and shop level councils, right? Well, we'll have specific groups of people based on performance. Number one, they have to self-select from their peer group. But number two, based on performance, that also helps vet these ideas and talks more in roundtable formats around how the company can be doing a better job. And we address a lot of issues around, responses to crisis, or, what we should be doing in terms of modifying the training, or even how we think about wage increases and when. And so I think that's also like sort of a second line of defense of making sure there's a more formal and structuralized process for people to give feedback and weigh in. And also, it's a rite of passage to sit on those leadership councils and feel like you're very involved, because we're all in them, and you get a lot of time with me, a lot of time with the management of the company. So that's another way I think that can be very helpful. So these are very basic, tactical, and sometimes I get overly tactical and less strategic, of just ways that you can make sure that two-way conversation is constantly happening. You're getting all of the best thinking, and you're allowing your workforce to weigh in on critical company decisions.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. I love getting very tactical. And just before I move on to the next topic, I wanted to ask if there's any issue that has come up, recently that maybe surprised you, or just was interesting, the solution that the workers came up with that maybe wouldn't have been how you would address it. If there's any sort of example that sort of stands out for you from that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that surprised me when we throw the benefits conversation in terms of what our budgets are, transportation, continues to be one of the top two, even for some above healthcare, as it relates to where they want to see dollars spent. So helping fund the transportation from where people work to the pizza shops themselves. And given there's been a lot of chatter around the lack of trust and concern vis-a-vis public transportation, we operate in cities, and some of these cities have been really challenged, with what COVID and the pandemic and societal issues have forced upon people, that it's not always as safe as it once was. And so how can a company help? And we actually did it through a partnership with Lyft, where they helped subsidize alongside of us, the family member transportation. And so throughout most of the pandemic, we were subsidizing, $20 per ride from where people worked at the pizza shops. And for a lot of our workers, that was the first time they ever were in a rideshare, and they're getting a private driver taking them to a pizza shop. And they absolutely loved, that process and being a part of it. So that it's just one good example. But we had a recent incident where there was an assault in one of our pizza shops, and that happened, a week and a half ago. And it was tough, because these things happen. But we were able to quickly solicit feedback on what was the right external sort of PR response. Like, what do we think the right way to approach it in terms of, retraining and, the that comes with a situation like that. So very influential in terms of crisis management, helping deliver what's the right company message. It doesn't sound like a PR firm wrote it. That is a combination of, the workers and the leaders in the organization coming together and saying, this is how we want to face it. And we'll fall on the sword if it doesn't work, but this is what's best for us. And we're all aligned on that. And that's how we're moving forward.
Yeah. Great. Thank you for sharing that. I'm sorry about the incident in the shop. I wanted to talk a little bit about technology and how you think about technology. We regularly, sort of in the press and in other forums, have conversations about technology's impact on jobs, and there's sort of the fear of automation displacing workers. And you have a tech background, and I know Ann Pizza's, trying to think about how to really use technology well. So I wanted to talk about that, and to start, as you think about incorporating different technologies, I'm curious, what principles do you rely on to sort of guide those decisions? And how have you thought about how technology affects the quality of the jobs at Ann Pizza? And also maybe, since we were just talking about worker voice, how do your workers think about that as well?
Yeah, I mean, technology is becoming more, I guess it's impacting the boardroom conversations in, food service more than ever before. I mean, we've always thought about technology in terms of efficiency, and efficiency more in productivity. So what are the things that we can do using technology that eliminate tasks that are mundane, that otherwise aren't that enjoyable or interesting to do, and can improve the quality of the workers' lives as well as the quality of the guest experience. And so a lot of the software that we built, which we call AndOS, which is our sort of internal operating system, is really about streamlining the operations of the organization, streamlining the customer communication, and making it really easy from a training perspective to operate inside of Ann Pizza. So the idea that there's a button to press with an answer for practically everything that you would need, and not to stunt or prevent learning, but to make learning really, really, really accessible, so you can focus on the fun things and not ever find yourself overwhelmed. The other side of it too is getting really good at leveraging technology, not just for sales forecasting, but labor deployment, right? Making sure that people are in the right places, because confidence in how you do your job oftentimes have to do with the actual staffing of a particular restaurant or retail, right, or pizza shop itself. So making sure that people are in their right places, that they're enabled to and empowered to do their best job, so they're not ever running around confused or feeling overwhelmed, which can bring your energy levels down and your customer experience levels down as well. And so it's really just been about fostering, a better working environment with better working conditions, and better ultimate like customer communication and customer experience. And that's sort of where the rubber meets the road. We haven't done a lot in terms of robotics or automation, largely because we've still found that human hands are faster, better, higher powered, and you get the human behind it, which we love as well. And I think I like that. But a good example is we are in the process of building out in our dough production facility, which is a large warehouse in Northeast DC, using some semblance of robotics to help with the production of proprietary production of our dough recipe. And that's just replacing, a mundane task that, quite frankly, if you were to ask the person that was doing, or the 2 or 3 people that were doing that before, it wasn't a job that they loved. They didn't love, cranking out 120 dough balls an hour. And that's just, smart. And we've repurposed them into focusing more on the R&D side of things, of how do we make it better? The machines can make it faster, but how do we make it better? And they're influencing how do you make it better, versus before they were just focusing on producing a certain quantity. And so it's repurposing labor where you're really using all of the strengths of what a human has to give, right? Both hands, body, and mind. And you're creating a better company as a result of that. So get away from the stuff that pulls you down, get into the stuff that picks you up, and ultimately creates a better organization. And I've talked a lot about robotics. I still think that they are, that they are further away than I think some people ultimately want to talk about, or what's like, clickbaity, or what is popular on Twitter. It's going to take a while. And every, location I've seen that has robotics or gone fully automated, it's lacking something special, at least as it relates to food, which is that human touch that we all value. And quite frankly, I just don't think the efficiency is there yet.
Yeah, that's really great. Glad to hear the robots aren't eating all of our jobs. And also, I wanted to just follow up on one point, because you were talking about sort of making sure that people are there so folks don't get overwhelmed, which is a really different way than sort of what we've heard in, different kinds of that different companies have used sort of scheduling software in terms of sort of making sure they have more like a minimum staffing level available. So just back to the principle, it sounds like you sort of have a principle of how does this affect the worker's experience kind of is what's guiding you. But I just wondered if you wanted to sort of comment on how you think about that versus sort of how that software is sometimes described.
Well, I think the idea, there's a lot of good software out there that we're seeing that's really helping with minimum levels of scheduling. And the biggest benefit to that is we actually do want to get really good at minimum levels of scheduling, because what that allows us to do is schedule significantly further out. So when you think about, states or cities that have fair work week, where you have to schedule 2 weeks in advance, I think it's really, really, really critical and important that organizations are able to do that. And we're providing software to help support that. And that really comes down to what can you absolutely guarantee in terms of people and hours for as long as humanly possible. Like, I would love a world where we say, okay, this particular pizza shop needs 400 hours of labor. And we're confident that regardless of what happens from a macro perspective, we will need every one of those 400 hours of labor. Well, then I can look at the workforce and I can say, hey, we've got 400 hours a week, right, in labor that we can schedule that we know isn't going to negatively impact, right, the P&L. It's absolutely required. And so we can take that out as far as we need and schedule across that, right? And it's a very different way of thinking about that way. We can give people guaranteed hours, schedules much further in advance, and anything that has to fluctuate, week in and week out, because that does happen in our business, right? If there's a tornado, if there's a hurricane, if there's a blizzard, right? Things that we can't ultimately influence that are going to bring sales down, or it could be 70, like we've seen in Washington, DC or New York this year, 75 and sunny in February. What does that look like? Because we know the registers are going to ring, or the proverbial registers are going to ring. You'll want to staff up for that. So kind of carving out that maybe 5% up to 10% variance and being able to toggle with, adding or reducing labor, but keeping that baseline really standard. So I actually love the idea of scheduling further out, fair work weeking the heck out of our businesses. That's extremely important, and providing more predictable scheduling. So I actually found that leads to significantly lower turnover. Right? A lot of these things lead to lower turnover, even though turnover is inherent. You have to accept the fact that businesses like ours, we have largely a part-time and hourly work. Their turnover is natural, but how do you curb it for those that have the opportunity to stick around? Well, you pay them more, you treat them right with dignity and respect. You schedule and give them hours much further out than any other concept, and you ask them for their opinion, and you get feedback on how you're doing. It doesn't have to be that complicated. It's just the basics of what it means to treat people a certain way often get lost in the day in and day out of running complicated businesses that are constantly break fix. So I hope that was an answer, but we always think about software in terms of being a better employer, providing a better job, because the reality is our pizza shops that have the lowest turnover at a minimum, right, produce the highest profits and produce the highest sales, and they're the most fun to work at and be a part of because the community feels that. And the community gives back when they walk into the pizza shop, right? They have a smile on their face because they know they're going to a place where the workers know their name or know their order. And it's a cycle that keeps on paying it forward.
Yeah, great. No, that exactly answered the question. Thank you. So I'm just wondering, on technology, you sort of mentioned that, there was the dough part that was automated, but you don't really, it's nice to have a human's touch in the stores. So we're not thinking the future of tech is necessarily depopulating the workplace, but I'm curious, what do you think the future of tech looks like for And Pizza, and what do you hope that will mean for workers as well as the customers and the industry?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do, as I mentioned before, it's just stripping out the job functions that don't require thinking, right, or critical thinking, and really automating that to a point where you can unlock, right, the best of what humans have to give. Right. There's one thing mopping a floor. There's another thing repurposing that labor, talking to customers in the dining room to make sure they're having a great experience. Right. And that's a good example of, if there was something that could mop a floor, right, I would love to repurpose and have a person that's not mopping a floor now being paid same labor dollars, right, to talk to our customers, to bus tables, to refill drinks and do all of sort of the soft touches that I think really differentiate, a fast casual or QSR or fast food concept, right, from its peer group, because so many don't do that. So it's not a race to the bottom around how do we strip the labor out. It's about repurposing labor to make a better experience. That's really what it comes down to. And I'm not a big believer also in this notion of commodity labor. I think businesses that have treated labor as a true commodity, candidly, given how wages are increasing, and this notion that you're going to be devalued, right? At the end of the day, you're going to be devalued because you're going to have staffing shortages. You're going to have a workforce that doesn't care. And ultimately, those workers are realizing, hey, if I want to go create this entity, right, that's And Pizza employees, like, we hold all the value. And so the employer no longer can look down at a workforce that's being paid less than what they're valued and say, this is the way of the world. Like, that workforce is fighting back, right? Both in terms of unionization, they're also fighting back in terms of, I'm just not going to show up to work, right? They may not tell you. And that's the majority of these workers. They're not empowered to go do something. They're just going to go take a job with an And Pizza, right? Or In-N-Out Burger, where they're being treated a certain way. And so I'm a big believer that commodity labor doesn't work. You have to empower your workforce. Robotics will help eliminate the mundane tasks that make working in QSR or fast food far less desirable. It will actually make it more desirable. And you can trade, right, the labor hours that we're going to, quote unquote, tasks that can be automated and can be eliminated, to running a way better business, because now you've freed up all of this labor that can be used to do the things that we, quite frankly, oftentimes can't find ourselves having the ability to afford. And that's why in QSR or fast food, that's why you get often such bare bones or such limited service, is because all of the labor is going towards production versus going towards hospitality. And so many of the kids, and I say kids, I'm 42 now, the average worker at And Pizza is 21, toggles between 20 and 22. They want to learn hospitality. Like, they want to do the things that I get to do when I walk into a pizza shop. right? They don't want to be stuck behind a service line, right, doing things that they know inherently can be automated. And so that's the excitement of it, is I think we can bring, fast food, QSR, limited service, hospitality to another level, provide an entirely different level of service, and light up the excitement around attracting workers back into because we've lost so many. Hospitality's lost so many, restaurant industry lost so many workers over the past 3 years because we've been so slow to wake up to the fact that you can no longer treat people like a commodity, like a spoke in the wheel. You have to show up, and you have to focus on treating your workers the same way you treat your customers. If a customer jumps up and down and complains, you do something about it. If a worker does it, you don't. It's like, now we need to get back to the basics of when the worker jumps up and down, it's more important than the customer because they have something to say, and it's critically important that you hear them. And so I'm eternally optimistic, but I actually think that there's a lot of good that can be done. I'm also into, some type of, public owning intellectual property around robotics as well, which is probably for a whole nother conversation. Spread the wealth when, this becomes, more and more of an issue. But I think we've got, a good probably, 3 to 5 years before this is becoming more and more serious. And I also think that you're going to find that companies that cut against the grain and don't go for a fully automated McDonald's, but look at, semi-automated around the mundane task and actually repurpose the workforce to do all the human touching, you're going to find the economics, the business, the overall customer experience and net promoter scores are going to go through the roof. And that's the most exciting.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, we will have a part 2 on that public ownership of intellectual capital. But as we're sort of closing this conversation, I kind of have 2 questions, really. One is just, you've talked about sort of and pizza and the ampersand as unity, and sort of how you think about sort of building that culture that really values workers and creates that positive experience. And so I'm curious, what you think about how much And Pizza really kind of demonstrates how to create good jobs, or, if there's more to be done to do that. And sort of relatedly, I know you've sort of advocated for raising the minimum wage in places and things like that. Sort of, what do you see as the role of government and the social sector, society at large, in terms of making sure work provides people with what they need to lead dignified and happy lives? So I guess I'm asking you to balance sort of how much does this sit with individual business, and what have you learned from the And Pizza experience, and how much of this kind of is something we should be looking to government and the social sector?
Yeah, I mean, I most recently spent the last couple of weeks in Maryland with the governor, who's fantastic. And, we are working on trying to...
I live in Maryland.
Oh, you do? Okay. Wes is an unbelievable human being, and very exciting to see new leadership in Maryland. But we've been working on trying to pull in and get the increase to 15 done by September, and then index minimum wage going forward to inflation. But something we don't need to get into too much today. I think one thing I'll tell you, and this is a good sort of example, is some of the smartest CEOs that I know that run some of the biggest companies, especially in food, they weren't talking about in 2019, they weren't talking about wages. They weren't talking about, reshuffling the deck and what it's going to take to bring workers back into their business. They weren't talking about reducing hours of operation because they couldn't staff, right, their location. They were pretty far behind as it relates to what it means to be a good employer, what it means to be a good jobs employer. When I say good jobs, it doesn't mean that my perspective on good jobs is different. It's what's going to influence the P&L. If you're purely thinking about profitability, you're thinking about 1 to 2 years out, right? There are obvious things that you're going to do to make yourself a good jobs employer. Their head was in the sand, and some of the smartest people I know. And so I think, part of government's job is to help and, those CEOs. And if the smartest CEOs in the world's head in the sand, what do you think that means for the mom and pop, right? Who may not even be thinking remotely close to or being professionally trained on what it means to run a business at all. And so I think it's more of like guardrails or kind of like guideposts around where do we need to be going and how do we think about that from an education standpoint, because even if you think your finger's on the pulse, like you could be missing. And so it's this notion of education. And I think minimums are extremely helpful. Minimums are maximums. It's not saying this is what you have to pay. It's saying this is the baseline of what you need to pay. I think it's extremely good. I think it's extremely healthy. I think, we've learned that, regulation, even more recently, right? The rolling back of Dodd-Frank, and what did that do? But regulation's helpful, right? Again, it helps us understand the playing field. No one wants to go play basketball in the pickup court without a referee, right? I'll walk three blocks down the street where I live in New York, and it's like, there isn't a game that occurs without a fight, right? And it's just like guys chomping each other. It's because we need the referee. We need to understand the rules. And I think that's what makes America so great, is that we have a set of rules that we all can play by. And I think, government's intervention in things like, wages and healthcare and childcare, women's rights, these are important things, because without it, we're a little bit lost. And like I said, smartest people I know, they get lost as well. And so I think it's really helpful that we all understand where we should be. We're indexing our companies against that. There are minimums that help guide policy internally in the boardroom and HR policy. And it helps us think about making sure that we don't get stuck in the mud, and that we don't have a policy that 10 years later finds us irrelevant and losing jobs and losing market share because we couldn't see 10 years out that wages were going to step up on average by $3 or $4 because there's a global pandemic and you have to pay people more to incentivize them to get to work. That's a classic example of like, it broke down. And so my perspective is it's all good. And entrepreneurs, small business, big business, we all understand that, CEOs as well. It's our job to navigate, right, anything thrown at us. And labor has been one of those things that hasn't changed for outside of maybe Silicon Valley and engineering. And it just hasn't changed for a long time in retail and restaurants. And now we're going through that disruption. And we're all now looking in the mirror, coming up with different solutions. And those of us that were further ahead, and quite frankly, the minimum wage was further ahead, it wouldn't be nearly the issue that it is. It just wouldn't be, right? Businesses in New York are not scratching their heads saying, how do I pay, $18 an hour to incentivize the workforce? Because they've been doing that because the minimum wage in New York City has been there. So that's a good example. I think we need it. It's critically important. And this is coming from a person who doesn't love, government intervention, everything. It's helpful. It gets everyone on the same playing field. It strips out an area that we're all scratching our heads saying, what's the right or wrong thing to do? And it helps guide businesses forward, I think, in a very healthy way.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Michael. This has been a really terrific conversation. Really appreciate your time and your leadership. Is there anything that I didn't ask you that you think I should have asked you about?
No, the conversation is great. I just appreciate you allowing me to share, a little bit of what I've learned over the past 12 years in this industry. And myself, like this business, we're a case study. We can definitely do better. There are things that we're not doing that I definitely want to get to. And the idea is, we're going to figure it out. We're one of many that are putting our heads down, right, in the face of very difficult operating conditions, for, all restaurants out there in the U.S. and just trying to band together and spread, whatever gospel we have to help influence leaders making the right decisions on behalf of their workers, and leaders making the right decisions that will allow them to, be sustainable and scalable into the future.
Great. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. This has been a presentation of the Economic Opportunities Program at the Aspen Institute. The Economic Opportunities Program advances strategies, policies, and ideas to help low and moderate income people thrive in a changing economy. For more resources and takeaways from this conversation, check the show notes or visit our website by going to aspeninstitute.org/EOP. While you're there, you can find countless other resources on ways to increase the availability of good jobs, including our Job Quality Tools Library, our Job Quality Center of Excellence, and our Statement on Good Jobs, to which Michael is one of over 200 signatories. We encourage you to read and consider signing on behalf of your organization as well. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope you'll join us again soon.